What's up, everybody? I'm Adam, and this week we are finally bringing another episode in our Model Aviator Instructional series to you. This is by far the most requested instructional video from our viewers by a long shot: how to land RC airplanes for beginners. A couple of things to note. Even though it says for beginners, a lot of the principles that we're going to teach in this video will still be helpful to many of you that are more experienced but still struggle with consistent good landings, so just keep that in mind. Everything that I'm going to teach in this video is based on my education and my experience as an RC instructor. I've been doing this a long time. I've instructed a lot of people with great success of varying levels. But that said, I remain absolutely humble. I learn new things about this hobby all the time. Don't claim to know it all. I'm not saying my way is the best by any means. I urge you to watch every video on this subject so that you see the one that resonates and aids you the most. When it comes to this one, it is going to be detailed, it is going to be comprehensive, so it will probably be lengthy. That said, we hope we've made it worth every minute of your time. There are quite a few things you can do to stack the deck in your favor when you're learning how to land an RC airplane, and the fact is most of that stuff is applicable to learning to fly RC in the first place. One of the best ways is, and always has been, to utilize a good instructor. You can't put a price on having a mentor that can stand right there with you and guide you through this process, keep you from developing bad habits, and teach you how to practice properly. But the fact is, a lot of people want to learn this process on their own. They don't want to utilize an instructor. And when you're teaching yourself how to fly, a good simulator is a great way to aid yourself if you can afford to utilize something like real flight. But even with a simulator, you can spin your wheels trying to figure things out on your own just as much as you can spin your wheels at the field. Obviously, the reset button that keeps you from actually crashing your actual plane is always going to be useful. But if you want your time on the simulator to be productive and you want to practice proper technique, you either need to utilize an instructor or an instructional video like this. Whatever the case, just make sure when you're on the sim, you're doing good work. Another thing that can greatly aid you is having a complete understanding of how to properly utilize the electronic automated modes that good trainers come with today. Safe Select is the most popular out there, is what's in this Aero Scout. And you need to understand, being in the self-leveling mode all the time, in the safe mode if you will, it's not really teaching you anything. Yes, you have the transmitter in your hand, and yes, the airplane is successfully in the air, but you're not really doing it. You're not really learning anything. In those modes, you can grotesquely over-control the airplane, and you don't have to pay for your mistake. You need to be in the most advanced mode that your trainer has. Liberal use of that panic feature to level the airplane if you get in real trouble is fine, but you need your mistakes to be exposed so that you can learn how to be smooth, precise, and deliberate. You just can't do that in safe. Now, we go over that because this is a landing tutorial. We are assuming that you've already got taking off and flying around without crashing reasonably figured out in the most advanced mode that your trainer has. That's the mode we're in when we're teaching you these techniques. So at the point of learning to land an RC airplane, some of you probably already have an RC trainer of some kind. Some of you may just be working with a sim and looking to get something eventually. Regardless, we're going to give you a list of 4 airplanes that we think are the absolute cream of the crop in the category, and then we'll tell you the features and the characteristics that they have that we believe make that so. Now, full disclosure, there are a lot of really good airplanes out there that you could technically learn how to fly on. I mean, technically, if you have enough resiliency and money, you could learn to fly and land with just about anything. The list we're giving you is simply the airplanes that, based on our experience, make the job of learning to land and fly RC easier than anything else out there. The E-flite 1.5 meter Apprentice, their 1.2 meter Apprentice, the FMS 1220mm Ranger, and this airplane, the Hobby Zone Aeroscout 1.1 meter, all share some key characteristics and features. First off, they have the automated electronic modes to make learning easier for you, including the panic button feature to utilize in the advanced mode that you should be in if you really want to learn. Also, their tricycle gear configuration with very tough gear. The tough gear is a no-brainer. If you're just learning how to land, your landings aren't going to be as smooth as mine are, and the gear on these airplanes can take that. The tricycle gear configuration makes ground handling much easier than a tail dragger. And they're very simple airplanes. They're all high-wing configuration with high-lift forgiving airfoils that don't have a lot of bells and whistles. There's no flaps, no lights, nothing to add tasks and things to keep up with for a new pilot. And the omission of all those things make these airplanes very, very light. They have the bare minimum you need to get the job done. They're tough. They have 3-axis control, tricycle gear, and variable throttle. And that's it. That's all you need to learn to fly, in this case land, and some things beyond. The lightweight makes these airplanes very floaty and very, very forgiving. They all share one characteristic that is really paramount, and that is all 4 of these airplanes will not stall. That's right. You can be at 100% rates on the elevator, and as long as you haven't made any mechanical adjustments to get more throw, you cannot stall these airplanes. You can power off, ease into the elevator until you reach full back elevator, and then just hold it there. They don't drop a wing. They just simply establish a controlled rate of descent, and you can hold that all the way to the ground if you want, and the airframes can take it. In fact, here's me doing that very thing with this plane. Shortly after I cut power here, I'm at full up elevator deflection. I can still turn the plane. I'm still completely under control, just in a steep rate of descent. I'm going to hold full up elevator all the way to touchdown, and then I'll wiggle the elevator so you can see it was at full up deflection. The ability of the trainers in our top 4 to do what you just saw is impressive to me, and I think it goes a long way towards building the confidence with a new pilot when they have to get their trainer slower than they ever have before and learn to land. But that said, these are not the only trainers on the market that make effective trainers and that you can learn the techniques we'll be teaching you today with. A lot of people like to use a lot of the sport bush planes that are on the market as trainers today, things like Tundras and Timbers, and those are very effective trainers. They're tail draggers, so that makes things a little bit more difficult, but they're still very effective trainers. I will say this. Those airplanes, unlike these, will stall and drop a wing if you get them really slow. But to be fair, you have to get really slow before that happens, almost to a stop. You won't be going that slow at any point in the training we're going to give you until you're actively touching the runway, so it's probably not going to be an issue even with airplanes like that if you execute it correctly. I will say this. You need to keep the flaps up on airplanes like a Timber when you're learning the techniques we're going to teach you today so that you keep the airplane as clean as possible and maximize your glide ratio. Why will be obvious in a bit. Now, invariably, somebody's going to ask me which one is the best of the ones that you suggest. That's subjective. What is the best for every person is impossible to determine. However, I will say that the Aeroscout has a leg up on most trainers because of the pusher prop configuration. That means that if a beginner makes a mistake and hits the ground like this, you didn't break a prop. It also means that if you have tall, gnarly grass as your runway, and that's all you have access to, the tall gear, big tires, and extreme amount of prop clearance means that the Aeroscout can handle stuff like that that would bog down other trainers. At this point, we're very close to actively learning to land, but there are still a couple things we need to do to make sure we're properly prepared. And the first thing is you need to make sure that your trainer is properly trimmed and balanced. Now, keep in mind what we're going to tell you works with the 4 airplanes that we mentioned specifically for sure. It's going to work with a lot of airplanes, but not with others, so your results may vary. You want to trim the airplane at 50 to 60% throttle so that when it's flying across the field at that throttle setting, it's hands off and flying perfectly straight. When you chop the throttle from there, the airplane should immediately, but not drastically, start a very gradual rate of descent. When you turn it around and you make that same pass at 50 to 60% throttle hands off, and you immediately go to full throttle, all those airplanes are going to start to climb given the high lift nature of the airfoil and the low weight. Now, that's going to be more pronounced with the Apprentice and Arranger than it will be with the Aeroscout because of the thrust line placement. If you do this test and when you chop the throttle, the airplane abruptly starts to descend fairly rapidly, and then you turn around and you get it full power, and it either barely climbs or doesn't climb at all at full power, that airplane's nose heavy and you need to move the battery in that trainer back a bit. If you do the test and you come across and you chop the power and the airplane maintains level flight for a bit before it starts to descend, and then when you turn around and you make the pass and you go to full throttle and it climbs abruptly, that airplane is tail heavy and you need to move the battery forward. Here is what it looks like when it's right, and bear in mind, I'm fudging the climb a little bit to simulate what the other planes will do because this is an Aeroscout. And the final piece of the puzzle, you need a runway. Now that sounds obvious, but it really isn't. If you're flying out of a sanctioned flying field or club, quite often they have a definitive runway. It might be geo, it might be paved, it might be cut in the grass, but everybody knows that's the runway. Some clubs have a pit area and then just a really large field, and anywhere on that field is fine. If you're flying out of a park, you're probably in the same boat. If you're flying out of a big parking lot, same thing. Anywhere is fine. Well, if anywhere on the parking lot or anywhere on the field is okay with you, you're not really learning consistency. You're not really learning to land well and hit a specific spot. And after all, one of the big differences in low-skill pilots and high-skill pilots is how much of the flight is manipulated. With a low-skill pilot, they survive a lot of aspects of any given flight. With a really experienced high-skill pilot, from start to finish, everything that airplane does is intentional, including the spot that they hit when they land. So, if you have to mark a runway off with cones, if you have to spray paint it in your grass, maybe mow some grass in your field, even if all you can do is visualize in your mind's eye, okay, from here to here, that's my runway and this is my spot, you need to have a runway in mind and a target. And when we talk about a target, we're talking about a specific spot. Now, in the footage that you're going to see of me flying the Aeroscout, I walk right out of our pit area and I'm standing right in the center of the runway and my aiming spot is directly in front of me. Now, we got a 400-foot runway. I don't need all that runway. Trainers land very slow, so that's fine for me. If you've got a shorter runway, there's nothing in the world wrong with making your standing spot closer to the numbers and making your landing spot right on the numbers. Now, we do teach, give yourself a little bit of fudge room. We teach a 30 to 40 degree cone relative to where you're standing. So if I'm standing here, I'm going to be aiming for that spot. But this is okay, and that's okay. Anywhere in that area, what I don't want to do is try to judge landing standing here, way down here, or way down there. And the reason being, when you're new, judging an airplane's speed and angle of attack is much easier if you have it within that 30 to 40 degree cone. If it's way down there coming right at you, very hard to judge. Way down there going away from you, very hard to judge. Now that doesn't mean that you won't get to some level of experience after hundreds and hundreds of repetitions of landing where you can stand here and hit the numbers right there based on some of what you're seeing and what you're feeling on the gimbals. You will be able to get there, but that takes a lot of experience, and that's the one thing that a beginner doesn't have. So have a runway somehow, some way, and have a spot picked out. When landing an RC airplane, or any airplane really, there are two fundamental approaches that are utilized. Now, both of those can be modified and adjusted a great deal depending upon the airplane and the circumstances at the time. Those two approaches are the power on or stabilized approach and the power off or gliding to landing at idle approach. Some people call it a 180-degree power off approach. When it comes to the stabilized approach, you are afforded the ability to adjust your power setting to keep the airplane in position throughout the entire landing pattern. When it comes to the power off approach, essentially what you're committing to is once you come power off, not touching the power again until you land. So consistency is at a premium with a power off approach. Now when it comes to the usefulness of the two approaches, technically you can land anything with a power off approach. The Bell X-1, X-15, and Space Shuttle are proof of that. It's just a matter of, do you have enough altitude and can you come in steep enough to stay at the proper speed to land that plane power off? Now that said, a lot of airplanes do realistically benefit from a power off approach and do it well, like the trainers in question that we're talking about today. But there are also a lot of airplanes that benefit from a stabilized approach. We will be covering the stabilized approach in a more advanced landing techniques video that we're going to do later on. For this one, given the glide ratio and forgiving nature of the trainers in question and the fact that we want to drive consistency in developing that home to beginners, we will be teaching the power off approach. When we go out to actively start learning how to land at the field, at our runway, we want to continue the trend of stacking the deck in our favor. Calm conditions are preferable. As a beginner, if you don't have to try to counter wind in addition to everything else you're trying to learn, that is a big plus. So try to stack the deck in your favor in that regard, if at all possible. You'll never be able to execute consistent power-off landing approaches if you can't first fly a consistent pattern, and a lot of RC pilots can't. It's something that becomes automatic if you practice it and you're really religious about just repeating it until you get it down. I can just pretty much do it automatically at this point, and it didn't take me long really to get to that. But when you're new, there's some tricks that might help you. So with a full-scale airplane, they fly a rectangular pattern because they square off every turn. They'll fly straight down the center line of the runway. They'll pick a landmark. They'll make a 90-degree turn, fly perfectly perpendicular to the runway. They'll make another 90-degree turn, fly parallel to the runway, and they just keep repeating the process. That is a pattern. Obviously, there's a premium on staying at the same speed and the same altitude. No different for us in the RC world as far as staying at the same throttle setting and the same altitude. 50 to 60% throttle is good. 50 to 75 feet, just depending upon obstacles and how big your runway is really good. What we modify is, when you fly straight down the runway, instead of flying a rectangular pattern, when it's time for you to make your turn, we want you to execute a 180-degree turn, a half circle. Fly parallel to the runway when it's time to turn, another 180-degree turn, looking to be lined up with the center line of the runway as you fly down once you complete that turn. It's important that you be consistent with the turns, and it's important that you be consistent with when you start your turns on both ends. Now, a couple tricks to be able to do that. As the airplane passes your position wherever you're standing, you can do a 1001 count and just go, 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, start my turn. You can use landmarks just like the full-scale people can. You can pick a tree in the distance that when you're flying parallel to the runway and your model gets to that tree, that's when you start your turn. But you want the distance that you fly to be as consistent as it possibly can, and you want to practice flying that pattern over and over again until every time you make that turn, you are flying straight down the center line of the runway. All this is going to make a lot of sense and help you a lot when you start doing actual landing approaches. Taking off here, and this first pattern example will be a bit of a low pattern, probably around 50 feet, and a bit of a tight pattern. Patterns are going to vary with size depending upon your circumstances, and that's okay as long as whatever pattern you're flying, it's consistent. Right down the center of the runway, 180-degree turn. Straighten up and parallel to the runway. Another 180-degree turn, trying to hold my altitude, keep the turns consistent. Lined up right down the runway again. More of the same here. This is just a higher, probably 75 feet, and a wider pattern. Keep in mind, the tricks that you used for reference at first, you'll only have to use for a short time. With practice, this becomes second nature, and you'll find yourself turning in very consistent places without having to keep up with any counts or landmarks. Taking the time to get good enough to fly consistent patterns is really going to pay dividends when it's time to learn to land, because we're going to turn part of that pattern into the landing pattern or landing approach, so it shouldn't be that foreign to you at that point. We talked about the rectangular pattern that full-scale planes fly. They turn part of that into their landing approach when they're flying a stabilized or power-on approach, and there are three legs to that approach. The parallel to the runway part of the pattern becomes the downwind leg of a landing pattern. They make a 90-degree turn here. That becomes the base leg of the landing pattern. They make a 90-degree turn here, and that becomes the final approach to landing part of the landing pattern. Interestingly enough, when full-scale pilots are taught a power-off approach, there's a reason they call it the power-off 180-degree approach. They're simulating an engine-out scenario. They're not actually cutting the engine off, but they're bringing the engine to idle and pretending that they lost their engine. So they abandon that squared-off stuff and do it more efficient. They cut the power on the downwind leg and then immediately execute a 180-degree turn or half circle to final, exactly the way we're going to do. So their base is essentially 180-degree turn just like ours is, and they do that to cut the corners and lessen the distance that they have to glide to their landing point. There's more to it for us as model pilots because we fly line of sight. Now the truth is, it's not that serious with model aviation. You could glide any type of power off pattern if you wanted. You could just add a little bit of altitude and you can fly that squared off pattern if you like. The problem becomes judgment. When you're standing here, flying this straight line on the backside of your pattern is pretty easy to do for two reasons. One, you're passing your position, and two, you have the runway right in front of you for reference. However, if you try to fly a standard stabilized approach pattern power off, when you turn that base leg and you try to fly that straight line, when you're standing here, you're going to have no way of knowing if you're actually perfectly perpendicular or 90 degrees to the runway or not. You could be offset one way or another. Being a gliding approach, that's going to put you out of position if you're offset when you turn to final. You're either going to be short or long of your mark, and that's going to put you short or long of your landing area. So we execute patterns and landing patterns with a 180-degree turn for consistency. You get used to starting that turn in the same place and executing that turn the same way. You're going to put your airplane position when you reach final in close to the same place most of the time, which means it's going to be a lot easier to be consistent hitting your area. So now you have a grasp of how your normal pattern work will actually turn into a landing pattern. The next step is understanding that when you cut the power in your landing pattern, that is the point at which you start your descent. Now, based on how we have the airplane trimmed, we know that our trainer from 50 to 60% throttle, when we go to idle, is going to gradually start to descend. But you have to control that descent so that the descent is consistent. And the way that you do that is tiny bits of up elevator to arrest the descent somewhat. You don't want to arrest it so much that you're gliding perfectly straight. You want to allow the airplane to descend. You just want to make sure that the descent that you're allowing is a consistent rate of descent from the point at which you cut the power all the way through your 180-degree turn into ground effect over the runway. And ground effect over the runway is your airplane's wingspan off the ground. You should reach ground effect well before your landing spot because you're going to use another technique to extend the glide to that point. So, quick review, you want to cut the power, control your rate of descent with up elevator throughout your 180-degree turn into ground effect, and this is what that looks like when you get it right. Okay, so I'm going to cut the power, and as I start my turn, I'm having to feed in just a little bit of up elevator because when you turn the plane, the rate of descent is going to increase. As I level the wings off, it's getting slower, and I'm having to add just a little more, and now we're in ground effect. We'll cover the technique we use from here in just a bit. The next step is determining where exactly in your pattern do you cut the power, and that's going to vary because, as we know now, pattern sizes and altitudes will vary. There's no one perfect pattern altitude or size. You have to do what you have to do based on where you're flying. You just want to be consistent. Whatever that altitude or size is fine. You'll just have to experiment to figure out where you need to cut the power with your trainer to end up in ground effect in the right spot. So with an airplane like an Apprentice 1.5, which has the glide ratio of darn near a glider, you may have to cut your power at the beginning or middle of the downwind leg and allow that airplane to descend for much longer to reach that spot. And it may glide so well that the trainer's natural glide and natural descent is something you don't even have to correct. Other trainers might be heavier, and you may need to cut the power at the beginning of your 180-degree turn, or maybe even in the middle of the 180-degree turn if it's really a heavy trainer and your pattern is lower. You just want to make sure that you cut the power wherever you have to cut it to end up in ground effect in the right spot over your runway. Here's an example of what it looks like when we experimented with the Aeroscout to figure out where we needed to cut the power. So here I've started my 180 and I didn't cut the power until final. And as you can see, the Aeroscout glides way too well for that, so I'm going to be long. So we're going to go around and we'll try something else. This time I'm going to try cutting the power in the middle of my 180. Much better, but I'm still going to be long. So we'll go around and try again. This time I'm cutting the power at the beginning of my 180, and that is going to turn out to be just about right. Right here I'm in ground effect, right where I need to be in ground effect. Now's a great time to cover missed approaches, which is what you essentially saw us doing when we were experimenting trying to figure out when to cut the power. When we saw we were going to go long 2 times, both times we just powered up, got back in the pattern, and tried again. Even once you figure out when to cut the power, you may not get everything right every time. If it looks like you're going to be short or long of your mark, you want to power up and go around, shoot a missed approach, get back in the pattern, and try again. Now, obviously, if you're low on battery or fuel, depending upon what kind of trainer that you're flying, if you got to land it, land it. Being short or long in that case when you're about to run out of power is fine, but if you're trying to build consistency, you want to be demanding enough of yourself to shoot for the area that you're supposed to be shooting for. If it looks like you're going to miss, don't take that. Shoot a missed approach and go around and try again. Now, we're going to show you some examples of a couple of missed approaches here where we actually cut in long and then cut in short of the runway. You don't ever want to try and fix that if you botch it side to side. You want to go around, shoot a missed approach, get back in the pattern, and try again. Worth noting, if you're missing side to side a lot, you need to get back up and work on that pattern work, because that shouldn't be a mistake that you make if you got the pattern flying down. You should be able to turn and hit the center line almost every time. Here I'm swinging wide of our mark on purpose just to simulate missing it. Now I'm going to power up, and you want your train of thought when you shoot a missed approach to be getting back in your pattern and establishing that consistent pattern as quickly as possible. Don't just power up and fly anywhere. Get back in the pattern. Here I'm going to cut in a little tighter, and you'll see me jink once I know I've missed, and then decide to go around. You'll be able to make adjustments if you miss slightly when you get more experience, but as a beginner, just shoot a missed approach and get back in your pattern. And the final part of our landing pattern or landing process is, what do we do once we get the airplane in ground effect, and why do we have it in ground effect before our landing spot? That part of the process is called the flare or roundout, depending upon who you talk to. Now, we know once we reach down ground effect, the airplane is starting to get slow as we further arrest that descent, and we have to go a bit further with the up elevator to arrest it. You may enter ground effect with a slightly nose-high attitude, and it is possible for the airplane's nose to be in this configuration while the airplane is going this way. That is because the slower the airplane gets, the more the nose comes up and the more your angle of attack increases. So as you reach ground effect, the process of flaring is essentially to arrest that descent even slower and more carefully. You want to go from ground effect to touchdown even slower. You want to ease back on the elevator. You know, once you reach ground effect, you may be around half elevator deflection. You should still have some in the tank left for your flare. And as you ease back on the elevator, you don't want to ease back so much that you cause the airplane to climb or that you completely arrest the descent, but you want to smooth it out so that the nose comes up and continue to ease back on that elevator until the mains touch the runway. Once that happens, you can release the up elevator, your nose will drop, and you simply steer the airplane with your rudder and your nose wheel throughout the rollout. The rollout won't be very long because you're going to be going very slow, and it is possible for you to touch down at full back elevator. The nice thing about trainers like the Aeroscout and some in our top 4 is the fact that, let's say you reach full back elevator in the flare and you're here, a foot, foot and a half off the ground, 2 feet off the ground. Let's say you've made a mistake. Well, we know with these that they won't stall. So it's just going to maintain a rate of descent that you can arrest, but when it hits the ground, as we showed you earlier, it's going to be fine. It's going to be a rough landing, but you'll be okay. You have to be careful if you're using something like a bush plane, like a Timber or a Tundra, something that may actually stall and drop a wing. That's why before this process, before you ever even start to learn to land with something like that, you need to take it up and see how far, power off, you can get into the elevator maintaining altitude before it actually stalls and drops a wing. You need to know how far you can go so that you know once you get in ground effect, you start flaring that airplane out, you know how far you can go. If you're about to reach the point of up elevator input that it's going to stall, you need to power up and go around if you're not pretty much touching the ground at that point, because if you stall something that will drop a wing from 4 or 5 feet off the ground, it's going to be nasty. Now, some may say, what is the point of this nose-high attitude and learning how to do this, and how does that apply to a timber or some other tail dragger? Well, you just learned how to do a 3-point landing where you touch main gear and tail wheel at the same time. The benefits of learning how to do that first is you learn how to get the airplane as slow as you can get it, and touching down at a 3-point stance can keep you from nosing over when you're landing in grass, and it also gets the airplane as slow as you can before touchdown, which means that you're not going to roll out as far, and that makes dealing with the rollout with a tricky tail wheel much easier to do. So here is some footage of a flare and how we go about that process. So as I get into ground effect, I'm going to arrest that descent a good bit more. I gave it a little too much there, so I just stopped pulling up elevator until the airplane starts to descend again, and then I ease back even more, get the nose up more, and I'm at full deflection right there as I touch down, holds the nose wheel up. Looks like I know what I'm doing. Here it is in full speed. So that is the complete process. That is how I teach my students to execute power off landings with an RC trainer. We're going to show you some examples of what it looks like when you put it all together now. Check these out, and we'll see you back here for some final thoughts about practice. We're just going to let you check out a few examples here. You'll notice that they all don't look exactly the same. A couple of them are from a tighter pattern, a couple of them are from a larger pattern. They're consistent enough that I hit my area each time, and while we're not shooting for perfection, we are shooting for that, and that's good enough. We'll take it. This one is a good example of how a trainer like this can bail you out. I'm going to actually over flare a bit and run out of elevator, but because it's an Aero Scout, turns out all right. This has been a very comprehensive instructional. Some may say too comprehensive. I honestly don't know if there's any such thing. I've seen a lot of instructionals that lacked a lot of details that we get asked about. Everything that we've taught in this instructional are things that we've had students over the years ask us about. It seems that different people have different struggles with different aspects of the landing process. So hopefully being thorough is going to help you, whether you're a brand new student that's just getting to the point of learning to land, or you know how to land, but there's still some aspect of it that you're struggling with. Hopefully something that we said and taught will help you. That is the reason that we've been so comprehensive. There is no substitute for understanding what proper technique is, and there's no substitute for practicing proper technique. Now you have to be realistic. You have realistic expectations. You're not going to be able to do this in a flight or two. But if you are demanding enough of yourself to keep you challenged, you will get better. That's just the way it is. You'll notice that there are pilots out there that fly pretty well, but still have very inconsistent landings. You'll also notice that most of them log one landing a flight, and that's it. When it comes to pilots that are very good and also very good at landing, you may catch those pilots shooting touch and goes with just about anything at any given time. Never forget that practice makes pretty damn good, but staying pretty damn good takes practice.